You're listening to Forge Theater Labs,
a podcast devoted to exploring theater history.
Where does that idea come from?
concepts in storytelling.
Is anything that original?
Isn't that just an assumption?
And the creation of theater from behind the scenes.
How do they even do that?
This is Forge Theater Labs.
History, innovation, perspective.
Welcome to Forge Theater Labs. I'm Josh N Hsu, your host, and I'm thrilled tonight to talk about puppetry, teaching, and the practice of imagination. Our guest tonight is Molly Maslak, a puppeteer, creator, educator, and visual storyteller whose work explores the expressive potential of objects, materials, movement, and imagination. Through puppetry and devised storytelling, she creates experiences that invite audiences into worlds where ordinary objects become extraordinary characters. As both an artist and a teaching artist, her work reminds us that storytelling is not only something we observe, it is something we actively participate in. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm happy to be here.
We're so happy to be here because I love puppetry, and I love puppetry both as an artistic practice and as a way of learning. I'm really sort of excited to talk about how stories emerge from objects for you and how you get audiences to participate in these acts of imagination. And so I'd like to start off with an icebreaker, and I think we'll start with materials first because I have so many different ways that I could take this. But I would say, what is a material you never get tired of working with in puppetry?
That's a great question. I love working with found objects, such as found natural objects. So sticks and twigs and pine cones and feathers. Those are the things that I never get tired of playing with. I never get tired of handling them, collecting them, and putting them together in a variety of ways to make something new. Because they are from nature and because they are these natural colors, they lend themselves to being all kinds of different creatures, animals. And there's just a natural pipeline there. And so I never tire of working with natural objects.
I love that. I specifically love natural objects and puppets because it reminds us about sustainability as well as the sort of ephemeral nature of puppets. Like, like after this performance, it's going to go away. Like we're going to deconstruct this puppet, perhaps, or maybe save it. Yeah. But there is this sort of idea that it can sustain itself or it can be, returned to nature, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And so, I think I would start with this first. What made you fall in love with puppetry? Like what was your introduction to puppetry and what sort of led you on this journey?
My introduction to puppetry, probably as with a lot of people my age, perhaps, was puppetry in television and film in like the 1980s and 90s. So Sesame Street and the Muppets and the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and all of those types of things. I recall seeing that, being exposed to it on film and in television before I ever experienced it live, which was a whole other level of experience. But I just recall being drawn to what seemed to me like toys coming to life, this tangible quality, it really felt like magic. And, at the time being, when you're young, you don't understand how it works. But I found that the magic really doesn't go away even when you do understand how it works. If anything, it kind of enhances it because you appreciate the work and the design and the engineering that goes into and the imagination that goes into bringing life into the inanimate. But I think my first introduction was television and film, and I'm so glad that puppetry is coming back to those mediums. Everything goes, everything's cyclical. So
absolutely. A lot of times when I think about like puppetry on television or puppetry in life as a child, the child knows that it's not a real object. Right. And so there's an invitation to imagination, that they are truly responding to the character that this puppet represents because they know that it is engineered. It is almost like immediately getting to see behind the scenes and not having to wonder about what's happening behind it because it's directly in front of you. Mm-hmm. What has puppetry taught you about the way people pay attention when they know the object is let's say, invented?
Yeah, I think that what I've learned about when people are experiencing puppetry, what I've observed and what I've learned through talking and working with people is that it seems like our attention spans tend to be, our modern attention spans are so brief. But when it comes to puppetry, I think because there's this added level of like, you're sort of, you understand on some level what you're seeing, but you're still having this experience that sort of can't be explained. And I feel like it does allow for a more enhanced level of focus where you're really tuned in because you're so enchanted. They stimulate such a sense of wonder, and also puppets are so innocent and vulnerable that I think as an audience member we can't help but lean in. And so I do think that the response to puppetry, it really does stimulate a more heightened sense of like awareness of what you're watching, as opposed to perhaps a human performer that we take for granted. Seeing other humans move and operate in the world, but puppetry is more nuanced and more rare to find. So I do think people lean in because also they don't know all that this puppet's going to be capable of. Whereas we have some sense maybe of what a human body is capable of, but as far as a puppet, we just don't know what this thing in front of us is going to do. It's such a mystery.
And so when you create a puppet or you're building a puppet, obviously it's impacted perhaps by the story that you're telling or that you hope to tell. But are you first drawn to its voice, its movement, its shape, or something else entirely? Like, where does that character of the puppet live for you? Because for me, I'm a vocal person. I'm on a podcast. So I imagine voice first when I think of puppets. What is the sort of first thing that comes to you?
That's so interesting because so many of the puppets I've worked with actually don't have a voice. So for me, the experience is very different. Usually what I'm drawn to is the shape or the kind of inherent sense of movement. So if it's an object or a creature or a material that has a certain style of movement to it, for example, like a really silky fabric, like it already has this inherent inequality of movement just by nature of what it is. And so from that, if you were to work against that and create a character that doesn't move in that way, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. So going in the direction, moving with, the sort of the natural quality of the thing, embracing the natural quality of the object or the material, is often where a lot of the character comes from for me. So I guess I start there, and then depending too, if it's sometimes I'll look at a piece of crumpled up packing material or some cardboard or and you kind of look at it, and I think and I've heard that I believe this has been proven to be true, that humans, we're always seeing faces in things. I think it's a kind of a carryover survival instinct that we're always, kind of looking for eyes that are watching us or whatever. But so it really serves you as a puppeteer to see faces and things, because then suddenly you're looking at a crumpled up, bit of fabric or whatever, and something's looking back at you, and it kind of is asking to be born, but there's not from nothing. It's already kind of telling you a bit about what it is and what it wants to be.
Not to put you on a spot, but is there a puppet perhaps that you can point to, that you can name, that you created, like a specific puppet that still resonates with you, that still sits with you, like lives in your brain rent-free forever?
Oh yeah, sure. I actually, it's like probably the most basic puppet I've ever made, and it was made purely out of play and experimentation. It's actually right back here. I can bring it closer. It's just a real scrappy little marionette that was made a couple of summers ago at the Eugene O'Neill National Puppetry Conference in Connecticut. And it was a friend of mine made a pair, And we were just going to kind of play around with, writing a little scene for these two characters. And before we knew it, like they were kind of fully formed. They kind of, it's like they whispered their names into our ears and we were like, oh, we know exactly who these two little women are and their relationship. And so much of that, I think, was dictated by like the way that their little fabric bodies kind of moved naturally and the way they kind of flopped around and the way they kind of stayed close together. And it just, this little puppet, her name's Blanche and her twin sister's name is Bev, and they perform together. But my performance partner and I just immediately fell in love with them because we were like, it's like they came to us and they told us who they were. And all they were like 30 minutes ago was a scrap of fabric and a couple of pieces of fishing wire. And it's just amazing how quickly something becomes something so endearing and so rich with personality and opinion and relationship. So it's just a great example, I think, of something that was very, very simple, very basic. We weren't expecting much out of it, and it just kind of gave us so much.
I think it's so interesting to sort of explore this sort of idea of like found object puppetry and sort of developing that art form. And so like my question for you was, as you were building these puppets and the story came to you and it was developed, was it improvised or was it like, okay, I'm going to sit down now that we understand who the character is, then the plot comes second because now we understand who the characters are? Or was there sort of like we have this rough outline of a plot and now we're going to fill it in with the characters? Like what order did that come in terms of operations?
That's a great question. So in the case of these two little marionette puppets, it really came, like we had a vague idea of what we wanted to do, but as soon as we made the puppets, we were like, oh, throw that out the window. Actually, what they want to do is this. Wouldn't it be great if we put them in this environment? And so the characters themselves really in that scenario dictated the story, and only more recently, after performing with them a number of times, have we kind of sat down now that we have a much better sense of the characters and their relationship, and have we actually written something down? But up till then, it was all improvised, and it was all play just based on this sense of who these little characters were. But I've worked in reverse in other projects too, where I came up with the story first and then developed the puppets after kind of already having a sense of or kind of figuring out who they were through the writing of the story. So I think it depends on the puppets, and it kind of depends on the project as well. But yeah, I've gone about it in either way.
Sure. What do you think sort of is at the heart of a process when the script is determined and then the puppet comes second? Versus, in the case that you say here, like the script comes second, the characters come first. How does that dictate perhaps the building of the puppet itself when you have a script that's established?
I think it's a lot more challenging, in my experience, to have the story and sort of the requirements of the puppet first, and then to go and build and create the puppet, because you are having to really, I struggle with the engineering side of puppetry. I can kind of get a table full of random objects together and just go for it. But if I need to make a puppet do a very specific thing, I'm like, okay, that takes like a side of my brain that really like makes me work very differently. And so I've definitely worked on projects where I've been given a couple of line items of, the puppet needs to do this. It needs to be this size. It needs to, fit through this doorway. And that's much more challenging in my experience, because then we're taking this kind of wild idea and somehow creating it in such a way that it's practical, which is so difficult to do. And also, often too, like, non-puppeteer will want a very specific puppet or puppet design or puppet build or and with the assumption like, oh, well, you're a puppeteer, you can make it do anything. And that's that's very hard to accomplish. Usually there have to be compromises, as with anything, as with any kind of live performance or design or any of that. But
Absolutely.
yeah,
I think there's a difference between puppet engineers and the sort of actual puppeteer. If they're the same person,
yeah.
that's one thing. But then to sort of be able to engineer something, hand it off to someone and say, well, you go and take care of it now. It's yours. And like,
Yeah.
you don't live with it.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about sort of, like, thank you for sharing all of that on puppet engineering. But like, let's say someone does deliver a puppet to you and it is pre-constructed. What is your process for like getting acquainted with it? Like learning its rhythms, learning how it breathes, how it speaks. Like, where do you begin in your process? Because I've heard from so many puppeteers, some of them who were on the season, about like where their process begins. And so I thought I'd ask you, like, where does that start for you when you sort of first encounter a puppet that's pre-made?
Yeah, I love that question. And it's something I guess I've not like consciously thought about. I've taken for granted. So it's great to have the opportunity to like think it through. I think I start with, how do they breathe? How do they do? I guess I start very, very small and then build from there. So how would they, like scratch their face or rub their nose, or maybe even like, look over their shoulder, all those, the very small um, movements and reactions, the kind of micro movements, before getting into, okay, how do they walk? How do they jump? Um, I've had the experience of exploring movement with a pre-made puppet, both as like the um, single operation puppet and multi-operator puppet. And that's interesting too, because you're figuring out with several other people how this puppet moves and how you work together. So that's a whole other, you know, question. But to answer your question, I start very small. And I just remember one of my first lessons in puppetry is, how does if your puppet starts sleeping? I think the lesson there was like, it needs to be asleep, not dead. So the first thing it needs to do is breathe. And then from there, maybe it starts to lift its head, maybe it rolls over, maybe it, begins to slowly wake itself up and sit up in bed, or, adjust its body, because all those little small movements that we do before we really start the day is a good place to start. And so that's usually where I begin. And then I think it's also interesting to play with the puppet you're exploring and another puppet, so that you understand how it reacts to another character. That tells you so much as well.
I think it's so interesting about, like, as a manipulator of a puppet, like, the more you engage in it, the more you sort of, right, pay attention to everyday things and other people, like things that we take for granted, small little micro gestures, small little micro movements. And so I guess this is a great question, which is, like, is there anything that, in terms of empathy, that you've learned through puppetry? Like, is there something that you find that, like, you've opened yourself up to? Like, what have you learned about empathy through puppetry, I guess, is my question.
Oh yeah, empathy and also vulnerability. I feel like you get a lot of lessons in both of those qualities um, when you're working with puppets. And I think because so often um, puppet characters are often, or characters are who are puppets are often, um, they're in the position where they are learning something or exploring something, encountering things for the first time. And so when you see a character doing those things that are very vulnerable, maybe approaching another creature for the first time, or um, just trying to navigate a new place, um, it, it kind of forces us to, that I feel like we're able to strip away the judgment more easily when we're watching puppets do those things, because why would we expect them to know any of that? They're exploring their world for the first time, perhaps, and versus, if we were watching a grown adult, kind of fumble around, it might feel a little clownish or a little foolish. Whereas in puppetry, there's almost like a newborn quality to them, and and so it's not that everything they do is cute. I don't, definitely don't think all puppetry is cute, and I wouldn't want it to be. But that there is like a sense of exploration, like gentle exploration in a lot of puppetry, or just, playfulness, which is, playfulness is kind of rooted in sort of experimentation, or, just kind of learning cause and effect, pushing boundaries. And so, being able to watch a puppet do those things, or use a puppet to explore those things with an audience, I do think that it stimulates a different level of empathy, because they're so inherently like, there's like an innocence there, and like a newborn quality almost, where you're watching them be very vulnerable, and it's not awkward in the way, or like doesn't cause the like cringiness that sometimes we can feel just from a state of uncomfortability when we're watching like a human person go through some of this. I think some of that's stripped away with puppetry.
I think so too. I think it's interesting because, I have children, and I've gotten to watch two of them start to engage with puppets in different ways. And there's a sense of wonder of what they can create. Like, they're surprised at like how much they can create, and this being comes to life. And it sort of brings it back to their own sort of sense of wonder. And so I think that's such an essential part of like puppet making, puppet engineering, is to sort of be able to engage in your own sense of wonder, while also recognizing that that's what gives that object life. I think this is a great place to take a break. Before we go, just a quick question, fun question. If every object had a personality, which one would make the best protagonist?
I think something that has maybe some like some soft edges, but that is, I'm trying to think of a specific object. Something that's kind of upright, and I could imagine like a cattail. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like that grow at the edge of like a lake or a swamp. Something that's kind of upright. There's a little flexibility. There's a little, like the edges are a little round. So that's my answer.
My answer is, just because I'm a Lord of the Rings fan, I feel like a tree, like an ent. Like, I want that tree to come to life. It's got those shapes. It's probably got things carved into it. It's got age and wisdom.
It's seen some stuff.
It's seen some stuff, but it's still sturdy, right? It's still present.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back. This is Forge Theater Labs. We're talking to Molly Maslak about puppetry, and more on puppetry in a minute.
At Forge Theater Labs, we're building bold, imaginative theater, supporting new artists, new stories, and new ways of experiencing performance. We're proud to share that Forge Theater Labs is now a sponsored project of Fractured Atlas, which means your donations are tax deductible and directly support the creation of this podcast, live tapings, and artist-driven projects. If our work has inspired you, made you think, or brought you closer to the theater community, we invite you to help keep it going. You can make a donation by visiting forgetheaterlabs.com for our link to our Fractured Atlas page. Every contribution, big or small, helps us forge new pathways for artists and audiences alike. Thank you for being part of our community.
Welcome back. I'm Josh N Hsu. This is Forge Theater Labs, and we're talking to Molly Maslak about puppetry, about building characters, about building worlds. So we spent this first segment talking a little bit about what brought you to puppetry, the different materials. I thought we sort of pivot to talk about styles of puppets and what styles of puppets you've explored, because you have deep experience across many different mediums. And so tell us a little bit about your experience with different styles.
Sure. So my sort of my introduction to operating puppets myself, I was thrown into a theater production in which the director was really interested in puppets. She wanted to have a shadow puppetry element. And so we put together a screen and they put me back there with two projectors and a couple of other actors. And we just sort of figured it out. And so we used a lot of skewers. We used a lot of cardstock and manila folders and transparencies and natural materials that had some texture and some, visual interest. And we played a lot with light and shadow. So I have a lot of experience in shadow puppetry. It has a big place in my heart, and I come back to it often. But since then, I've also explored rod puppetry, both single operator and multi-operator rod puppetry of various sizes. So everything from, something that's maybe 6 inches tall to something that is, 5 feet tall. And then I've also explored marionettes. That's something that's still relatively new to me. And there's a lot, in all forms of puppetry and in puppetry in general, there's so much still that I'm learning. But marionettes, it's like a whole other bag of worms. The ones that I operate are very, very basic. And I find that you can still get so much movement and variation from them. But I know that there are some that are more advanced and that have, triggers that will open and close the mouth and lift a hat up and down and, send a little dog running and all kinds of things. But the ones that I have had the experience of making and operating are very basic and, but still so effective. And that's something that I have learned in both observing puppetry and really masterful puppeteers, and in also learning and doing puppetry myself, is that a little goes a long way. I've also worked with found object puppetry, and that's something that I've incorporated into classroom lessons for intro to puppetry with a wide range of student ages. And that's something that has its own unique challenges because it can be so hard to look past what the thing is already and to see what it could be. But there's just no end to what you can do within object puppetry, and especially when it comes, when you begin to make like composite puppets and you add multiple objects and make it into a whole new thing. That's really exciting too. So that's kind of the breadth of my current puppet experience. But I am always wanting to learn more.
I would ask you, obviously all of us puppeteers really have one puppet that they favor the most, but in your opinion, right, what kind of stories lend themselves to certain styles of puppets? Like, are there stories that you find, I am working with, a macabre story. So, clearly rod puppets tend to lend themselves. Marionettes tend to lean into that creepiness that we want. Whereas if we're telling something sweeter on the innocent side, perhaps we're talking about found objects. Like, are there different styles of stories that speak to you and lead you to different puppets naturally?
Yeah, I think so. And I do think that genre has something to do with it. I think that, realism versus abstraction, like how real, what does this moment call for? Does this moment call for, a realistic puppet? I saw a production years ago where it was Richard III and the two, young boys that end up getting murdered. Like, they were represented by puppets, and they were semi-realistic puppets, like just enough to make it really effective. And really, you like felt it in your gut when these little puppet boys get offed. And even though that they are puppets, and it's, but there was something kind of chilling. And so I think seeing them in 3D for that story made more sense and created that that visceral reaction from the audience, versus if we had seen them in 2D shadow puppets, it would have been, I think, less effective while still beautiful, but we wouldn't have felt it, I think, in the same way. So I do think that considering, do we want it to be more atmospheric? Do we want the puppetry to be more atmospheric, or do we want it to be more realistic? And are we playing with scale? What can we get away with, and how would it change the story or the moment if this puppet isn't to human scale, or if it isn't, or if it's this creature is, this fish is far larger than it would actually be. Like, what does that, how does that change what we're saying about this character, about this moment? So there are so many considerations. And I do think that a lot of people, the more puppetry they're being exposed to, the more those decisions, the more nuanced those decisions become, because I think for so long, commonly, culturally, we, in the West, associated puppetry with a moving mouth fabric puppet, and that, if there wasn't a place for that specific type of puppetry and what you were working on, then why would you use puppets? But puppetry is so much more broad, and I do think that more people in general are becoming more aware of the variety that is available to explore.
Absolutely. I think, so much culturally is dependent upon, the larger IPs like Muppets, Crank Yankers, like Avenue Q, even like that Sesame Street. Like, we are accustomed to sort of approaching puppets from that perspective. And then, when we see Victorian dolls, we associate that with, oh, okay, well, that is clearly of the macabre now, right? Obviously. But I think, puppets kind of like change over time historically based on what we as a culture sort of think of that experience. And so in terms of medium, do you find that how you work in, let's say, film or live or whatever it may be, alters your experience with the puppet, how you manage the puppet, how you build the puppet?
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that one big challenge for sure is you can get away with different things in different formats, right? So when you're doing things live, usually the audience, if you're doing things within a theatrical production, the audience has arrived ready to suspend their disbelief, and they have arrived sort of prepared to not see, for there to be some abstraction, for there to be some gaps that they need to fill in with their imagination. Some things are going to be, maybe there will be a facade of a house, or maybe there will just be a chair and like a window frame hanging on some wires, and your brain fills in that this is a living room. So the audience has come prepared to fill some things in, which lends itself, I think, to puppetry. And to puppetry that's maybe a little more abstract. For example, there was a fantastic theatrical production that I saw where there were bird puppets, but you understood them to be birds, but really they were just hardback books that were being, flapped. And, you as a theater audience member, you are willing to accept that and you understand, versus it might be, I think it's a different experience when you're watching puppetry on film. Film is, there's so much realism in film, and also you're seeing things are shot really close up. So unless it's a really strong like stylistic choice, usually it seems puppetry for film is more realistic. Unless, and I've seen a lot of shadow puppetry start to be used in film, which I think is very cool. And it can bridge those gaps in the storytelling where maybe the character's describing some other place or another time. So I do love that. And that has been where I've most recently explored puppetry on film, was to do some shadow puppetry for film. And that, I think, does give you a little more freedom, where you're not I didn't feel as concerned about, Okay, this looks great from, arm's length or from, 6 feet or 10 or 15 feet. But when I get this close and the camera gets this close, what is it that we actually see? And does this, is this believable? Is this, are we going to be able to also frame it so that you don't see the puppeteer? That's the really tricky part. Whereas also in people have different schools of thought on whether, it's okay to see the puppeteer, to see the rods or the strings or, the wires, whatever. But I do think that that's something we're more willing to, in general, accept in live performance. And then on film, people are so willing to point out, like, I saw the string. And it just creates a different experience. So there are different limitations and freedoms in both.
As an audience member who attends theater, I want to see the strings. I want to see the rods. I want to see what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, there are times I really appreciate Bunraku when they cover up, themselves and they're completely hidden. You can't really see their expressions. So they're not, only the character lives, but I want to see it. Like, I want to know what they're thinking. I want to see their breath as they bring breath into the character. And so that's something that appeals to me. What is like, obviously it's dictated by perhaps directors not wanting to see those strings, but what is the school of thought behind not wanting to see rods, not wanting to see strings? Like, is this, are we sort of headed into a realistic representation, I guess? Like where does that sort of come from?
It is interesting. And I think that is, I think it's more of an old school mentality, an old school puppet mentality. And surely there are still, I'm sure there are modern puppeteers who do prefer to not have rods and strings and things be seen. I think it's the explanation is that it's ruining the magic, but we already know, my point of view is we already know that magic is happening. We understand that this is not a real creature and that it is being operated. And so I think rather than, if trying to hide those things and then there's a slip and then that's it's seen as like, oh, they slipped up, they made a mistake, kind of embracing it, as you said, and not necessarily, not hiding it within reason. There are some things you want to like clean up the visual picture. That makes sense to me. But to try and hide it all together, I think is not necessary. I love seeing the connection between the puppeteer and the puppet. And I find it fascinating when usually my eyes are on the puppet, but I do glance up from time to time to see what's going on the puppeteer's face. And it can be really fascinating if the puppeteer's not hooded. Sometimes they are, and I've done both. But when they're not hooded, it is fascinating to see there is this pipeline between the two. I mean, they're sort of connected by an umbilical cord, if you will. So what's happening to the puppet, the puppeteer is experiencing in some way. They kind of have to be. So yeah, I enjoy that too.
I want to pivot a little bit because I've had this conversation with many a puppeteer and many an actor. And I think, obviously there's a connection between the puppeteer and the puppet. And, there are some schools of thought where puppets should only live with puppets. Like if you're going to do a puppet show, no puppets, no people beyond the puppeteers themselves. And there's another school of thought where it's like, yeah, like we want to see puppets interact with people. And what are some of the sort of wins and challenges, like things that you find exciting when characters need to interact with created characters, so to speak, right? In both contexts, like how does that sort of play out? And what advice perhaps would you give to a puppeteer in that moment?
Yeah. I love productions that incorporate both and films that incorporate both. And I think that advice that I would give to those that are trying to pull that off or engage in a story that incorporates both would be to, oh gosh, where would I start? I think that giving the actors and the puppeteers space, a space to play in together as early on in the process as possible. I know I've been involved in productions and in situations where you don't bring all those moving parts together until kind of later on in the process, which I'm sure there are strategic reasons, or, there are lots of reasons why, scheduling and whatnot, but to share space together as early as you can, so that, there's so much spatial awareness in puppetry, and in acting also. But in puppetry, you're having to be aware of your own body and then this extension as well. And then when you're an actor interacting with, puppeteers and puppets, you're also having to build in that additional awareness. And so much of, I think when that is done well, it has to do with being so aware of, where everything is in relation to you. And also it can be, I think, tricky to, if there are two characters and they're speaking to each other, if there's an actor speaking to a puppet, establishing where those sight lines actually are. Where do you actually need to look? Both the puppet and the person. And also, I think too, the sooner you can all get together, the sooner you can kind of establish the, what is this world? Because this may, if it could be an established world, or, most likely there's some kind of hybrid situation going on. And so establishing like, what are the rules here? And, what are the parameters by which this works? A play that I wrote actually some years ago, incorporated, it had both live actors and various styles of puppetry. And I know that what was an interesting challenge in that piece was, how do we make sure that everyone is well lit, which was like an interesting, just because you've got some puppets that are much smaller than a human. You've got some that are human sized. You've got some that, it's not like lighting skin. It's, it's like texture, it's fabric, it's, bark and all these things that kind of eat up light. And so that's also an interesting challenge, kind of on the practical side of things. But yeah, I think I love seeing when those worlds are blended beautifully. I think it can also, I think we've all seen like examples of when like, oh, maybe that didn't quite work, but that's not to say it can't. I think that it's well worth trying.
Something that's resonating with me is how important the eyes are on the puppet, like in order to build that connection with an actor. Because, as an actor, we're told like, look at the other person, right? Like look deep into their eyes, especially like if you've done Meisner, it's like, that's everything. Like you need to be connected with that person. And so I am also imagining if we have to do a rehearsal puppet, like maybe we just build the eyes first. Like it's just a puppet. Forget the body, forget the arms, forget the legs, right? Like let's just put eyes on it so that we can build that connection between characters.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I think we're going to take a break there. I think that's a wonderful place to take a break. And then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about teaching and what it means to sort of teach puppetry and that experience. This is Forge Theater Labs. We'll be right back. And we're talking to Molly Maslak. Want to get your brand in front of a passionate, creative, and engaged audience? Forge Theater Labs is looking for partners to sponsor this podcast and join us in bringing bold, innovative theater to life. If you'd like to place an ad right here, reach out to us at marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. It's a simple, powerful way to support the arts while sharing your message with listeners who care about creativity and community. Again, that's marketing@forgetheaterlabs.com. Let's build something extraordinary together. We're talking to Molly Maslak about puppetry, about her experience with different styles. And I think in this final segment, I'd love to sort of explore how Molly has helped people discover that creativity isn't something reserved for professionals. Puppetry offers a unique invitation into storytelling, collaboration, observation, and play. And so I think I'd sort of start here, Molly. What first drew you to teaching?
So that's interesting. I think teaching kind of drew me to it. I didn't go out seeking it, and it's something that I stepped into right out of high school. I was a teaching assistant for a number of years with very young preschool age students, and then it kind of evolved from there as I got more into the arts and had more, was developing more skills that I could share with others. And so nowadays, so that's kind of where my teaching journey began. It was something that I stepped into not knowing how long I'd stay, and then found that I had sort of the temperament for it and loved the creative side of it. And I think something that is required of you as both an educator and as an artist is relationship building and building trust. And so that certainly went hand in hand. And so there's been a lot of overlap in my career and in my artistic journey with education. And so what education, the role it plays for me now is more on the arts side of things. As I said, I started out teaching very, very little ones. And now I've had the experience, and I'm very grateful for the experience to have taught all ages all the way, through adulthood. And each of those age groups brings its own challenges and celebrations and lessons.
Sure. Let's talk about sort of like the different age groups. Like, what excites you most about introducing, obviously there's children, but like perhaps an adult to puppetry for the first time?
Yeah. So what I love about introducing puppetry to adults, most adults that I've encountered, they don't necessarily have an established place for play in their daily lives any longer, unless they happen to be a performing artist, in which case they have some relationship to play. But even so, it's not the kind of sort of untethered, unbridled, free exploratory play that we experienced when we were children, where, there's not a specific way you have to do this. And allowing them, giving them the space to play and experience puppetry, I just see them light up, and I see them, there's often a little hesitation at first, just because there's this need so many of us have as adults to need to know, how do I do it correctly? Where should I start? What should I do first? Is this okay? And once they kind of get over that, and transition to more like experimental place, and as long as as an educator, if you're able to kind of create that safe space, it really results in some lovely freedom. And I just see them kind of glowing, and I don't take all the credit for that at all. It's just, you create the space and welcome them in, and they do the rest themselves. But it is really lovely, and I feel like it's so important to carve out, as adults, to carve out places for play and for experimentation, without the expectation of creating a product. So my experience in doing this with adults has been really, really lovely, and I think for them, uniquely challenging, because adults have so many skills, and putting aside the need to I need to learn exactly how to do this thing. This is a skill I need to acquire, and it doesn't have to be that way. it can really just be play.
Has sort of the act of learning puppetry taught them perhaps something that had nothing to do with puppetry, like something outside that they realized, oh, you know what? My thought process when it comes to puppetry has actually informed my actual life in this way.
Yeah, I would say that the adults that I've worked with who have worked with puppetry or maybe returned to puppetry or some kind of, this is their return to sort of a creative art form of any kind or creative pursuit of any kind. What I hear from them is that it reminds them of sort of the person they used to be or the interests they used to have, or like, I used to do things with my hands. I haven't done that in a long time. This isn't necessarily the thing I'll continue to do, but this is the thing that kind of unlocked that memory of, oh, I used to color, I used to draw, I used to paint, I used to use clay. I used to feel that I could do things that I kind of have just lost touch with. And so I think that that there's a lot of beauty and a lot of like potential healing in that. Just through, some playtime with puppets.
I think that's so interesting is that I think my experience with teaching after teaching for many years was that I learned that adaptability is the most important skill in learning. And it's not necessarily having a system, having a way to go about things, but to being able to adapt to what you have. You may have ideas, you may have all of those, but all of those are laid bare when faced with a challenge. And so I think being able to adapt in that moment is something that I think is important. And I think teaching teaches that. And I think, building a puppet, being able to manage it, being able to adapt to what that environment, what that material is that you're building, I think is incredibly useful. So I thought I'd turn it over to you, which is, how has teaching changed your own artistic process? Like, obviously, we always hear about teachers learning from their students.
Absolutely. And then before I even get to that, that's a great question, but to touch on something you just said, which was the adaptability, it kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier on in our conversation about, I have this idea for a puppet, for a character that does this, but this is what I have to work with. So what can I do with what I have? And I think adaptability and resourcefulness are so important when it comes to puppetry and also in teaching. As having worked in education for a long time, often our resources are somewhat limited. Is a
Understatement.
Gentle way to put it. Yeah. And so learning to do with what you have, learning to, whatever big idea you had, how can you adapt it so it's something that that still sits right with you, that still feels good, that still serves other people, that still tells the story, or that still meets the needs of your students with what you have. And I feel that combination of adaptability and resourcefulness breeds so much creativity. And it's absolutely my experience in education and working with students. And also, understatement again of the year is what works for one student or for one learner does not work for every student or for every learner. And so having to constantly improvise and be creative and be adaptable, and to not be so married to your idea that you're clenching onto it, you're rigid, and then it doesn't serve you and it doesn't serve anyone else. So all of those things, experiencing them in education and working through and being, creatively solving problems within, on a classroom, a team of educators, essentially an ensemble, lends itself and is so transferable to the performing arts and to puppetry specifically. Trying to do a lot with a little is kind of the name of the game when it comes to working in a classroom and when it comes to working in theater. So yeah, I feel like the lessons I've learned have been immensely informative of my my development as an artist.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's so important. And I want to point out that I'm not like the most adaptable and most resourcely person. I don't mean to say that at all. I mean to say that that is an aspiration for those of you who know me
same.
and then are going to call me out after this podcast. Because obviously I am a very methodical person, but I do find that puppetry, engaging in these sort of like found object arts forces me to sort of be more adaptable. And that's what I appreciate out of it. If everyone took one of your puppetry workshops, what would you hope they carry away? What might the world have a little more of? What would you say, Molly?
Yeah, I think the world, what I would hope they come away with is a confidence boost. I think that when you are when you come into a workshop, and if it's not something that maybe you've done a ton of, or maybe you have, but not in this style before, or maybe you're a performer, but you've never performed in this way, that the best thing I can hope for is that they try something that they didn't think they could do, and that they come away feeling like, it may not have been perfect, but I did it. And it might have been uncomfortable. It might have felt really vulnerable. It might have, it wasn't all that I maybe imagined that I wanted this puppet to be, but like I made something, or I told a story that didn't exist before with nothing but this, assortment of objects, or and there's so much power in being able to communicate through story in every format. And so being able to do that, and being able to put yourself in a being able to push through some uncomfortability, that's kind of what you hope of all of your students, kind of regardless of the subject, is that they push through something that feels undoable or uncomfortable, and they come out on the other side of it, feeling, more of a sense of confidence and freedom in, that wasn't impossible. That was something I told myself I couldn't do, and I did actually do it in some way. And there's so much to be learned and gained from those types of experiences, and from all of the little failures and successes therein. So that's what I would hope for a student of mine that came through a puppetry workshop, or a student of mine that came through any classroom or educational setting of mine, is that they come out the other side of it, a sense of having done something that they told themselves they could not, or that would be just too impossible, too uncomfortable to do. And I've seen it many times, and it's really awesome.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing this. For those of us who want to see your work, do you have any current and upcoming projects that you want to share?
Yeah. So what I'm working on right now is developing the Bev and Blanche characters that I mentioned. We're continuing to develop their story and their characters into a longer form live puppet show that we hope to bring to the La Jolla Playhouse Without Walls Festival. Bring back, I should say, because they were at the festival the last 2 years. But we're continuing to develop them and their piece, and we're hoping to bring them back in 2027 and establish their connection with their little with their community there. So that's something that you can look out for. And I'm always collaborating with other people in my community as well on puppetry offerings that are local, or that we have the dream of taking on the road. So if you're interested in seeing any following along as those things happen, you can. Should I?
Yeah, feel free to shout out. Website, socials, wherever we can find you.
Yeah.
Obviously, we'll tag you on this podcast and also share that. But please do.
Awesome. So you can connect with me on Instagram. It's at Molly Maslak. And then you can also find me online on my website. You can see examples of past work at mollymaslak.com.
And if people want to take a puppetry workshop with you, where do they go? Like where can they sign up for a class, educational opportunities? Where should they look?
So if they wanted to do something like that, where I have done puppetry workshops most recently in San Diego, California, where I'm based, would be at the Actors Place, which is located in the Mission Valley area. And that is a studio that offers all kinds of workshops for actors and performers. And if you're interested in doing a puppetry workshop there, reach out to the studio, let them know you're interested, and we will be sure to offer something like that.
Fantastic. Any final shout outs, any kind of invitations for people interested in puppetry and engaging in visual storytelling?
Yeah, I would say it has been a pleasant surprise to me how often when you just bring up puppetry amongst friends or colleagues or coworkers, how often you'll find at least one person who's like, oh, I love puppetry. And you just like, there are little hidden fans of puppetry everywhere. And I would say seek those people out. And also there's probably more puppetry happening in your community than you realize. I would say look for puppet slams in your city or in a city nearby. They're happening all over the country. I think that the Puppet Slam Network has even gone beyond the US as well. That's a great place to find puppetry. Also, if your city or a nearby city has a fringe festival, you can often find some really interesting puppetry at fringe festivals as well. There's more puppetry out there than I think that non-puppeteers realize. It's hiding in plain sight. So I would say it's worth a little search.
And for our puppeteers or people interested in puppetry in the Portland, Maine area, might I recommend Port Fringe to see a bunch of puppetry. This year has already passed. Our festival is already closed at this point when this episode releases, but feel free to check out that. Also, don't be afraid to check out Mayo Street Arts, which has puppet slams, which does have tons of puppetry, and we love them. Please go check them out. That's my shout out from Forge Theater Labs. Molly, thank you for sharing your work, your process, and your perspective with us. It's been a pleasure exploring these stories, how these stories emerge through objects, movement, design, and imagination, and how you help people build these same stories. Thank you for joining us.
It's been my absolute pleasure. I will talk to anybody and everyone about puppetry. If you ask me about puppets, that you've done it.
Well, you've heard it here first. So if Molly gets spammed suddenly, we know why. Thank you so much. This is Forge Theater Labs. Have a great night, everyone.
This episode was hosted by Joshua N Hsu with post-production by Sam Rapaport.